So, the theme today is the Tithe Wars, actually. We're going to look at almost 100 years of history, from 1836 to 1936, and centering in on two periods in particular. That's the 1880s and the 1930s. The 1930s was the culmination of what at the time people described as the Tithe War. I mean, this is a front page from the Daily Mirror in 1931 describing an auction of seized produce in Stelling Minnis, where farmers disrupted the auction, and there were scuffles and so on. Bullocks stampeded, auctioneer pelted with mud. Throughout the 1930s, this Tithe War, which was the most important rural protest movement of the interwar years, this Tithe War involved farmers refusing to pay the tithe rent charge, as it was called at the time. They faced court proceedings, after which their livestock and also their possessions and even their furniture could be seized for non-payment of the tithe rent charge. They confronted bailiffs, possession men, as the bailiffs were called, who would, after produce had been seized, would be posted on the farms to guard the stock before it was auctioned or removed by people who had bought the stock by tender. They lobbied politicians, they waged a media campaign, and they engaged lawyers to challenge the legality of the measures being taken against them by the tithe collectors. And the protests prompted the government to act. In 1934, a royal commission was established, and a report came out at the beginning of 1936, which led to new tithe legislation, and in effect, the beginning of the end of the tithe, which was that the history of tithe goes back to the mists of time. It's not the subject for tonight's for this afternoon's lecture, and it's a controversial topic, of course. But 1936 was a key moment in this history, not because of the wisdom of politicians, but because of the campaign which was waged by farming communities with the support of many, many others. So tithe has its origins in the mist of time. I mean, the legacy we see today, in Maidstone, the museum is a former tithe barn owned by the Archbishop. A lot of the wedding venues are former tithe barns. Tithe means 10% of produce which was handed over to the church in medieval times. But in this country, for centuries, tithe became the thread binding the church with the state and with the landed aristocracy as well. Because by the Reformation, or just after the Reformation, 1/3 of tithe was in private hands. Rich landowners, but also the leading educational institutions in this country, Oxford University, Cambridge University, all the major public schools collected tithe. Charities, what became hospitals, Guy's Hospital, St Bart's Hospital, all collected tithe. 2/3 though was collected by the church. Now, most European countries abolished tithe in the decades or so following the French Revolution. And in this country, in the early decades of the 19th century, there were demands to abolish tithe. Tithe featured prominently in the rural revolt of 1830, for example, the revolt known as Captain Swing, which again began in Kent, at Rotton, for example, in 1830. Between 400 and 500 labouring people gathered at the rector's mansion and to cries of bread or blood demanded that he cut his tithes in order to allow the farmers to increase labourers' wages. In 1834, there was a meeting of the farming community organised by the major agricultural association in Kent, in East Kent, on Barham Downs. And 3,000 people turned up, and the meeting was hijacked by radicals who proposed a resolution to the meeting. And the resolution denounced, this is from the Kentish Gazette, denounced the evils inflicted by the tithe system and called for the abolition of the present system of tithes. And the Kentish Gazette, and I know this because I found it over here somewhere in this building, denounced this work of revolutionaries and levellers seeking to subvert the government. So in 1836, we had the Tithe Commutation Act. Now, in most countries in Europe, tithe was abolished. This act didn't abolish tithe, it commuted it into a cash payment, the tithe rent charge. Tithe becomes a cash payment to be paid by the occupier of the land to the tithe owner, either the church or one of the private tithe owners. And it was calculated on a complicated formula linked to the price of wheat, oat and barley. This meant there would be big variations in the amount of tithe paid in different parts of the country. The main wheat growing, corn producing regions tended to have higher tithe now than the pastoral farming areas. So the tithe wars, when they break out, are mainly concentrated in the sort of southern part of England and also of Wales. And there are additional charges as well. There's the extraordinary tithe, which is an extra tithe for hops and fruit growing, which were considered to be particularly, well, they were, profitable crops. And so people who had land which was growing these crops of hops and producing fruit had to pay extra tithe. And in the event of non-payment, the tithe owners had the right to go into a farmer's property, to go onto their land, and to distrain, was the word they used, to distrain the produce to make up for the tithe that they weren't receiving. So that was the 1836 Tithe Act. This wasn't the abolition of tithe, this was a compromise. It was, in fact, part of the liberal reform programme of the 1830s, the Great Reform Act and other reforms around that time. But the point is that tithe remained controversial and deeply resented in farming communities. And the result of that was the Tithe War. And there were two waves of this Tithe War, the 1880s and the 1930s. Now that brings us to our Kentish tithe warriors. As Mark said, I'm going to mainly talk about two, but there's a few others who are going to crop up in this narrative. And this is one who does crop up in this narrative, although he's not the direct subject of today's talk, because the protests in the 1930s were coordinated by the National Tithe Payers Association. By 1934, this association had organisations in 22 counties. But the cradle and the major hotspot of this tithe war and the cradle of this association was Kent. The National Tithe Association's president was Reverend Roderick Kedwood, a Methodist minister who between 1929 and 1931 was the MP for Ashford, the Liberal MP for Ashford, and he farmed at Westwell, close to Ashford, which today is, I think it's part of the M20, or is completely destroyed, that area. But it was there was a big estate there, owned by a member of the aristocracy, and after the First World War, the estate was sold off to all the tenant farmers, Kedwood's father bought, Kedwood himself actually bought his plot, and he farmed in Westwell. And there's a monument to him today at Ashford Market. And at the top of it, it says Tithe. It's not a monument just to him, but it's to his role in leading the campaign against the tithe. Now, this talk is going to feature two other tithe warriors. Firstly, this man, Frank Richard Allen, who was the secretary of the National Tithe Payers Association. I found a lot of stuff about Frank Allen in the Canterbury Cathedral archives, because between 1902 and 1924 he worked in the cathedral, and he was actually the tithe collector. But he ended up as an example of a gamekeeper turning poacher, because he ended up leading the struggle against the tithe from 1924, when he becomes the National Secretary of the National Tithe Payers Association. And the National Tithe Payers Association office was either that one or it was that one. It was one of the buildings, one of the offices upstairs in 19 St Margaret's Street, Canterbury, which is just a stone's throw from the cathedral's gates. The second one, unfortunately, I haven't got a photograph of this man. I'm still waiting, possibly a genealogist who has studied the Peterson family perhaps will come up with a photograph. But Edward Whitred Iltide Peterson, 1858 to 1934, the son of William Peterson, the rector of Biddenden, who is quite famous for all sorts of reasons, actually. If you Google him, you'll find out his daughter was prosecuted, I think in Maidstone, on the charge of murder. And I think she was sectioned. It was all over it was a big scandal in the press, I think in 1890 or so. But one of his sons, Edward Peterson, was a solicitor. But if you look at his obituary in the Times, an authority on tithe. They called it at the Times, he was one of the greatest authorities on tithes. And he was known as the parson's friend. And basically between the 1880s, the late 1880s, and 1937, he campaigned to defend the tithe, to defend the rights of tithe owners, and particularly to defend the rights of the clergy in collecting tithe, and also to resist the tithe payers movement. So we have a character on both sides of the conflict. So the agitation against the tithe, against the 1836 Act and its repercussions, begins in the 1880s. And it begins in the early 1880s in Kent. And the main agitation is against the extraordinary tithe, this additional payment for orchards and hop growing fields. It was a campaign led by something called the Anti-Extraordinary Tithe Association, the main animator of which was Albert Bath, who with his brother ran Colgate's farm at Halstead. And they, in 1881, began a campaign of tithe payment refusal, refused to pay the tithe. This picture here was produced. This cartoon was produced in the 1930s. In fact, it's not contemporary to the 1880s. It's an indication of the connection between the Tithe War of the 1930s, the way they looked back for examples at what happened in the 1880s. But this is the report from the Seven Oaks Chronicle on the 2nd of November 1883 about events at the Halstead farm. Basically, each year in the early part of the 1880s, the Baths refused to pay the tithe. The bailiffs came in on behalf of the tithe owner and said, we are going to take that, we're going to take that, we're going to take that. And there was an auction on the farm. In 1883, events got particularly violent, although this is exaggerated by the press undoubtedly, but someone knocked the auctioneer's hat off, and this was followed by various missiles being thrown at him. One of the parties threw a small bag of soot and his face was completely blackened. Subsequently, his clothes were torn to shreds and altogether he was severely ill-treated. This is what the cartoonist is describing there 50 years or so later. So in the 1880s, agitation against the tithe in Kent is focused on three areas, in fact. The marshlands around the Swale, the area around Sevenoaks, and also the area around Maidstone. It begins in the Bath, on the Baths farm in Halstead, but it's much wider than just an incident involving Albert Bath. I'm making that point because some historians have presented this as a bit of a sideshow, a bit of a pantomime involving Albert Bath. Well, no, it's not. It's a much wider protest movement which he was at the head of. There were many reports in the local press, and they give an indication of the scale of these protests. At East Sutton, for example, after proceedings instigated by the Dean and Chapter of Rochester Cathedral, 34,000 hop poles on Byton Court Farm were seized and put up for sale. But the South Eastern Gazette reported that notwithstanding a strong north-east wind and snow falling, farmers and labourers estimated that a crowd of 1,500 people turned out to witness and try and prevent the carrying out of the sale. These were big demonstrations throughout Kent against this extraordinary tithe. Now, Edward Peterson enters the story during events in Biddenden. In Biddenden in 1885, the rector, William Peterson, employed his son, Edward, as I say, was a solicitor, to issue the distraint orders to local farmers who weren't paying their tithe. And one of these distraint orders was served at the Wagstaff farm on Biddenden Road. And bailiffs seized 47 sheep, a cow, and an auctioneer arrived from London to sell the livestock. And press reports describe how this auctioneer was met by a large crowd of 600 people, and he heard, this is his testimony, he heard someone shout, "You will never leave this field alive." And he also complained that he was continually pelted with rotten eggs and other disgusting things that womenfolk in the houses above emptied on him, including jugs of water which were thrown out of a window. So there's a bit of an incident, put it like that, put at the auction. 6 farmers were arrested, and Cranbrook magistrates imposed hefty fines and sentenced one of them, Mr. Cooper, from Smarden to 1 month hard labour in Maidstone jail. And the jailing prompted a defence campaign, prompted protest meetings at markets, a petition for Mr. Cooper's release, who became known as the Smarden Martyr. And the government released him. It was a Liberal government at this point, and they released him after, I think, 2.5 weeks or so. And the Kentish Express reported the scenes as he came out of Maidstone prison. There was a big demonstration which marched through the Wealden villages back to Smarden. The paper reported at 11 o'clock a triumphant start was made for Smarden, with Mr. Cooper in the first vehicle, over which were banners containing the words, "Welcome to our martyred friend," and "Down with Tory tyranny." To the mighty blast from 2 horns, the procession went through Langley, where the villagers joined in the procession for a considerable distance until they reached Sutton Valence, to be met by the Smarden brass band. At Headcourt farmers from Cranbrook and Frittenden greeted Mr. Cooper, and refreshments were partaken at several different inns in the village. And at intervals, the band played "See the Conquering Hero Come." Now, this agitation against the extraordinary tithe led to an Act of Parliament in 1886, which alleviated some of the problems, although many of the underlying grievances would remain. Basically, extraordinary tithe was converted into an annual charge, but it remained there, although that took the heat out of the immediate grievances. Now, as the Tithe War in Wales, in Kent died down, the extraordinary Tithe War, if you like, an even more bitter conflict on tithe broke out in Wales. The Tithe Payers movement in Wales, there's not time to go into this, but it fused economic grievances about the tithe, but also with nationalist and nonconformist resentment about the privileges of absentee English landlords and the privileges of the Anglican Church. And the authorities responded to non-payment of tithe in Wales with a big, heavy hand. Large deployments of police and troops were sent into Wales to to back up the tithe collectors. And one of those tithe collectors was none other than our friend Edward Peterson. Because after collecting the tithe for his father in Biddenden, he decided to volunteer himself to the tithe collectors in Wales. The Clergy Defence Association was set up in 1887 as a defence association for the tithe owners, and they appointed Peterson as their agent. And basically, Peterson, for the next 4 years, toured every region of rural Wales to collect the tithe. And his modus operandi was to arrive in a district accompanied by a horse-drawn trap containing 8 emergency men, as they were called. The tithe payers described them as the bum bailiffs. Many of them were veterans of the resistance by landlords in Ireland to the campaign for land reform, which had been waged by the National Land League. And they came over to Wales, and they now began a campaign against the local farming community in Wales. And Peterson's trap with his 8 bum bailiffs would always be followed by wagon loads of police, and sometimes a magistrate would be there as well, just in case there was a need to read the Riot Act. The press has got full of incidents involving Peterson, including one embarrassing incident when his truck driver lost complete control of the horse when confronting a demonstration, and a court heard later on that this man who was driving the trap of bum bailiffs was very drunk. So Peterson goes off to Wales, but in 1890 he takes a break and he comes back to Kent and to his office in London, and he launches the Tithe Rent Charge Owners Union. Here's the report of the first meeting in 1890, and there he is at the bottom, the honorary solicitor, and in fact he was also, in effect, the animator, the organiser. He did everything for this association. It was set up as the Tithe Rent Charge Owners Union. It changed its name quite soon afterwards to the Tithe Owners Union, and later on it became the Churchmen's Defence Union, with Peterson running this organisation. Now, the agitation of the 1880s, particularly in Wales, but also there was a large amount of agitation against the tithe in England as well. It led to more legislation, a new act in 1891, which clarified that tithe should now be paid by the landowner, not the tenant. Many of those who have been in the leadership of these campaigns of tithe non-payment were tenant farmers. So they thought, well, if we say the landowner's got to pay, that's going to solve that problem. It also stipulated that if tithe exceeded 2/3 of the value of land, then that's the limit. There should be remission. over any tithe over 2/3 of the value of land, and also it stipulated that tithe owners had to apply for an order from the county court before they could just walk in to somebody's property and say, I'm having that. So they were the three reforms. There were 5 attempts to get this act through. It started in 1887. It was a crisis for the government for about 4 or 5 years, and in the end they got this act through. And it did take the heat out of the tithe situation, out of the Tithe War for a period. And that brings us to our second tithe warrior, because it's in this period that Frank Allen, 1902, in the period following this Tithe Act, as a young man becomes the head clerk in the chapter office of Canterbury Cathedral. And he moves, he's not from Kent, he's from London, he's from a modest family, his father was a warehouse worker, but he secures his position at Canterbury Cathedral. He moves to Tyler Hill, where he lives for the rest of his life, just north of Canterbury. And at the cathedral, he was a valued employee. He's promoted to become the chapter registrar, and in 1918, he's the secretary to the chapter, the most important lay official in the cathedral. And amongst his duties was to collect the tithe for the cathedral. And he did this diligently. He pursued farmers for payment in the county courts, and he showed little sympathy, actually, for farmers' complaints initially. But his work brought him into contact with the farming communities, and he gradually began to realise that tithe was a problem from which the church would be best to extricate itself. In 1919, he wrote a very prescient paper where he says, should these provisions of this Tithe Act, I'll mention that in a minute, prove not to be as effective as is expected, and should it happen that in 1928 or 29 tithe rises above its present level, and should there be at the same time, as may be the case, a depression in agriculture, then there may be serious trouble. Tithe is a great a nuisance to the payer and to the receiver. Now, in 1924, after a major row with the cathedral dean, Allen left the cathedral, and together with another Kentish man, a man called Sir Henry Rue, who lived in Wormshill on the Kentish Downs, who had been an agricultural statistician, had been involved in the tithe issue. The two men together set up the National Tithe Payers Association. And Frank Allen spent the rest of his life as a major thorn in the side of his former employers. The 30s was triggered by 3 developments now. The first was a major change following the First World War in land ownership. Many tenant farmers purchased their land, often paying over the odds, and saddled with large mortgage arrangements. And they were now liable to pay tithe because they were land owners. Secondly, the effects of 2 Tithe Acts, which during the war, the government guaranteed minimum prices for wheat. Now, because tithe was linked to the price of wheat, this meant the value of tithe to be collected rose enormously. And so they realised that, well, look, the church is going to be open to accusations of war profiteering if this goes on. And not only that, it was going to go up so much, 100%, well, actually more than a doubling, that most farmers wouldn't be able to pay it anyway. So they tried to peg it, a fixed tithe, at these amounts in 2 Tithe Acts in 1918 and 1925. And thirdly, though, the agricultural depression. The prices of agricultural produce and agricultural land fell dramatically after 1929. And so tithe had been fixed at a level that believed that the situation in the early 1920s and the optimistic post-war period will continue, and farmers will be able to pay this amount in tithe. But tithe acted as a lightning rod for farmers facing economic uncertainty. This is a quotation from a Kentish farmer, George Gill, Oxroad Farm, Elam, who talks about how, this is 1932, he's writing, there are few small farms which make any profit at all, costs are terrible, prices at their lowest, but tithe remains fixed at an average of 7 shillings to 10 shillings an acre. Now, the 1930s Tithe Wars then. And by the way, George Gill was the editor of this pamphlet, which we found here in the Kent archives. He produced about 6 editions of this throughout 1934 as a sort of bulletin for the tithe payers' resistance against the tithe. So, an opening shot in the Tithe War in Kent in the 1930s was this event at Ruckinge in September 1931. The previous December, there had been a meeting of about 100 farmers from all over East Kent in the Sandwich Guildhall. And that had formed the East Kent Tithe Payers Association, which was then affiliated to the National Tithe Payers Association. Again, in the archives here, we find lots of bulletins and pamphlets, the East Kent Tithe Payers Association. I think I even found somewhere here, there's a membership card somewhere amongst this lot. But the secretary was our friend Frank Allen. He doubled up as the secretary of the East Kent Association and of the National Tithe Payers Association. And at this meeting, it was agreed that farmers should conduct a policy of what they called passive resistance. The same term had been used in Wales in the 1880s, and in fact the same term had been used in Ireland when the Irish peasants launched a tithe war against the English landlords in the 1820s, 1830s. And they adopted this term passive resistance, and amongst this passive resistance would be non-payment of tithe. And so soon farmers were facing distraint orders in the county courts, and the courts made orders for the seizure of stock which would then be auctioned. And so the auctions became just like Albert Bath's auctions at his Colgate's farm in the 1880s. The auctions became a focus of the Tithe Payers Association's campaign, and undoubtedly they drew a lot of their methods and they learnt a lot of what they were doing from what had happened in the 1880s. Ruckinge was one of the first to take place. This report describes how a stack of hay had been seized, and National Tithe Payers Association activists had mobilised farmers and their families to attend the auction. And at this auction, this script was followed in most of the others. At the start, Roderick Kedwood, or it could be another leader, will get up onto the rostrum and make a speech about the iniquities of tithe. And then when the bidding began, the crowd would ensure there would be no bids, except somebody at the back would turn up and bid a pittance and then buy the stock, and they would be handed back to the farmer. Now what happened at this one, as you can see here, was that, I'll read it from my notes here. When a stranger bid £5, there were angry murmurs amongst the crowd. And when the stranger shouted £10, the crowd surged forward towards him and hustled and bustled him about the farmyard. Mr. Kedwood stepped forward and bid £500. And the farmers attacked the stranger, pelted him with mud, stones and bricks. The man drove away by car amid a hail of mud and bricks. And eventually the lot was sold to a Tithe Payers Association activist for 10 shillings once the auction started again. Well, I'll use this example because who was the stranger? There's pretty good evidence, I'm not 100% certain, but I'm 99% certain that it's our friend Edward Peterson, because the church had been in touch with the Clergymen's Defence Union just before this event and asked them to supply somebody to go along to bid and to buy this produce to ensure the auction was was a success. If it wasn't Edward Peterson, it would probably be his son, who at this point was also involved in the anti-tithe payers movement. And so this event here, we see the two men, Edward Peterson, our two tithe warriors, Edward Peterson and Frank Allen, were both in the crowd at Ruckinge on the 15th of September 1931, but on opposing sides of the issue. Now, I'm going to fly through the next and finish in about 5 minutes, because we're going to fly through a number of other auctions and events. A week later, there was the events at Stelling Minnis, which you saw right at the beginning of this talk. This propelled the Tithe War to the national press front pages, because by now the authorities were becoming alarmed. The church authorities were becoming alarmed as well. The chief constable of Kent was told by the Home Office, "You better go down there and sort this situation out." And he did turn up at this particular event to witness the auctioneer being attacked by an angry crowd. Again, I think some of the stuff in the press is exaggerated. It's exaggerating the violence, but I don't think it exaggerates the anger. I mean, lynching. Another report was about the auctioneer being lynched. This one's true. The chief constable's hat knocked off with a wet sack at this particular event. So these tithe auctions were becoming an embarrassment and counterproductive, both for the church and for the authorities. And so what happened was the church, the institution of the church, which was called the Queen Anne's Bounty, which was the tithe collecting institution run by the church, to collect the tithe and to invest it and to hand it out to the clergy and so on. They won an application in Ashford County Court for distrained goods now, not to be sold by public auction, but by tender. So you put them out to tender, and that would avoid these flashpoints, these auctions, and you start to see these sort of things appearing in the local press. This one's actually just over in East Sussex. This is a farm in Iden, I think that's how it pronounces, on the way to Hastings. And the church also, together with other tithe owners, launched their own company called General Dealers, which was run out of a hotel in London by some ex-military men who were sent to bid for the stock, and then they had these tough guys, ex-military people, who went onto the farms to remove the stock from the farms, and it would be taken away and put on ecclesiastical commissioners' farms dotted around the country and then dispersed. So the next stage of it all is these seizing of stock for non-paying the tithe, but then sold by tender. And so the attention of the tithe payers movement now turns to disrupting the tendering process, including attempts to remove the produce by those who have purchased it. In many cases, this company called General Dealers. One example is this example here at Great Mungem near Deal in May 1932, which led to arrests and a fine, where a possession man who was guarding the seized stock was approached by a farmer and farm labourers, and the paper article says the men placed a scarf around his neck and carried him to a cowshed. They then carried him to a cesspool into which they threw him. When he emerged, one of them said to him, "You are lucky to have got off with what you have got." Well, the man who was taken to court for this incident was this man, Fred Solly, who was a local farmer, a dairy farmer, sold milk, but also set up Solly's Kentish ice cream, which of course delights us even up to this day. One of the most dramatic incidents was this one at Elam in November and December 1932. Farmers around Elam owed tithe to Merton College, Oxford, and they refused to pay the tithe. And the goods were distrained on 10 farms, and possession men were posted on these 10 farms. And another Oxford college, a new college, purchased the produce from Merton College, and on the 7th of November they sent 3 trucks to Elam to collect the tithe, to collect the stuff which had been seized, which were a collection of things like sheep, there were some cows, there were some chickens, there was farm implements and machinery, and so on. And the Times, 8th of November 1934, reports how hundreds of farmers and their supporters assembled in Elam Square to await the first move on behalf of the tithe owners. Scouts were posted to observe the movement of police and bailiffs, and the movement of the lorries in the district was also watched. And basically, seeing the opposition, seeing the pickets which had been put up all around the farms and this great crowd who were waiting in the square, the convoy retreated. This was the headline in the Daily Herald. In fact, the interesting thing is both the left-wing papers and the more right-wing papers had a sympathetic view on this protest movement. The Daily Herald was a Labour paper, the Daily Mirror was a Conservative paper at the time. But they came back on the 22nd, on the 21st of December, and this time 200 police were in tow. And in quite comical scenes, described very well in this article in the Daily Mirror, the 2 police wagons, they look like furniture vans, collided in the narrow lanes just to the north of Elam, and so the whole thing was a shambles. The farmers had removed the stock from where it had been stored, where they expect the bailiffs and the people who sent in to get it expected it to be. The goods had disappeared, and basically there was a number of comical incidents of solicitors chasing chickens around the field, trying to pick them up, and in the end they got 1 or 2 chickens from this whole field. And there's a picture in one of the papers of the solicitor carrying one of these chickens with his face covered in mud and so on. So it was a shambles and a victory for the tithe payers movement. The tactic of removing stock from under threat of distraint to neighbouring farms was common. This is a case at Frittenden in March 1934, where the tithe owners had earmarked 12 pigs and 2 bullocks for seizure, and they just disappeared in the middle of the night under the noses of bailiffs. Farmers' secret meetings, shadowy figures were sacked, pigs and bullocks disappeared, tithe bailiffs fought it. And no one heard anything or saw anything. The Kent Messenger, March 1931. And I think the final example would be which hit the front pages under the heading Battle of the Ducks. And the focal point of much of the Tithe War in Kent was the farm owned by Roderick Edward at Westwell. And on the 3rd of September 1934, general dealers arrived at the farm, and they removed a sow, a bull, farm machinery, and 56 Indian runner ducks. And the animals were taken to a farm owned by the ecclesiastical commissioners near Shepherdswell. And this is how I first got interested in this, actually, because they were put on the farm near Shepherdswell, and the local tithe payers movement, farmers primarily from the Elam Valley, but also coming up from Deal and Sandwich, 100 of them launched a raid on the farm in the middle of the night and removed the ducks and took them back to the farm in Westwell. And it was described as the 150 masked men raid a Kent farm, the Battle of the Ducks. A few days later, there's another pitched battle outside the Westwell farm, because general dealers went back to try to get the ducks again, but also to get back a field of crops, wheat, and so on. And this, interestingly, highlights the role of women in the struggle. Women lie in the path of raiding lorries, farmers and women lie in the road. So that's really it. Well, time's up, I think. The recovery system was in crisis by 1934. There were 7,700 outstanding non-payment distraint orders in the county courts. Here in the case in Whitstable, Judge Clements, the Kent County Court judge, says it is becoming impossible, owing to the number of cases, to administer the law. And the Lord Chancellor says it is certain that if the court were to ask to execute all the unexecuted orders, it could not do so with any reasonable time, precarious position. In other words, they clogged up the recovery system, they clogged up the court system, they made the law an ass as far as tithe law was concerned. And again, the figures, the number of outstanding orders for distraint, in other words, farmers were saying we're not going to pay the tithe. In Kent it was 1,232. The next biggest was Suffolk. So Kent was very much the hot spot of this campaign. And a royal commission was established in late 1934. That led to a new Tithe Act in 1936, which introduced sufficient reforms to take the heat out of the Tithe War. Basically, the government bought out the tithe owners, gave them issued bonds, so they would have a regular income. Tithe payers still had to pay a charge, but it was a reduced charge, and it was collected not by the church or tithe owners, but by the Inland Revenue. And this continued, in fact, until 1977, when, under the finance bill introduced by the Labour government in 1977, tithe was finally put to rest. So that is a truncated version of what's going to be in my book when it comes out next year. So I've skirted over, rather simplified some elements of it just now, but I think that's given you, an impression of the Tithe War and our tithe warriors. Thank you.